Hello, and thank you for joining everyone to the First Amendment Museum. Thank you for joining the First Amendment Museum for this December's installment of our online speaker series. If this is your first time joining us, the First Amendment Museum is a nonpartisan nonprofit located in Augusta, Maine. I'm Max Nospish, the manager of visitor experiences at the First Amendment Museum. We rely as a nonpartisan nonprofit on gifts from viewers like you to continue the work we do. So if you enjoy this presentation, if you're watching now or in the future on YouTube or our website, please consider donating to us. Also check out our website for future speaker series installments, events, film screenings, along with other great content and opportunities. Tonight, I'm joined by Nico Perrino, the Senior Vice President of Communications for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or more commonly known as FIRE. FIRE is a nonprofit civil rights group whose mission is to defend and sustain the individual rights of all Americans, free speech and free thought. FIRE educates Americans about the importance of these inalienable rights, promotes a culture of respect for these rights, and provides the means to preserve them. If any questions for Nico as he is presenting tonight, please put them in the chat if you're watching on Zoom, or in the comment section if you're watching via Facebook, and I'll try to get to those. Stick around at the end and we'll do a Q&A with Nico, where I'll get to your questions. Nico, glad you could join us.
Yeah, Max, thanks for having me. And I appreciate the First Amendment Museum for putting this on. I think the discussion that we're going to have today is an important one, especially in light of some of the broader discussions happening in the society surrounding hate speech and offensive speech. It's kind of the core question that we have to ask ourselves if we're going to make a principled defense of freedom of expression. Why do we defend the speech of those we disagree with? And to begin our discussion today, I kind of want to take a journey pretty far back, almost 20 years, to talk about how I kind of came to become interested in these sorts of issues. Name's Nico Perrino. I grew up fairly Catholic. There was one summer in particular where I remember trying to go to church every day. I was bribed by my Sunday school teacher with breakfast at McDonald's if I went. But I started to have a change of heart in the early 2000s. Some of you might recall this was the time when the so-called Four Horsemen became popular. These were people like Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Richard Dawkins. And they were not just atheists. They called themselves anti-theists. So you can imagine these were people who I vehemently disagreed with. But I believe one of them came out with a book called God Is Not Great. I started reading that. This was also around the time of 9/11, where discussions about religion and extremism were very prominent. And I started to have a change of heart, a crisis of faith, as some might put it, and started reading more of what they were putting out and ended up kind of putting aside my Catholicism. I don't know that I ever really forgot some of the lessons from it, but I became an atheist. And when I went to college at Indiana University, I joined groups like the Secular Student Alliance. And it was around this time when I went to Indiana that there was a documentary that was put out. It was called Collision, and you can still find it if you go to Amazon. It was debates between Christopher Hitchens, who died in 2011, a famous, if you're not familiar with him, kind of left-wing atheist radical, and this guy, Douglas Wilson, who was an evangelical pastor from Idaho. And I was on the side of Christopher Hitchens, as you might guess, around this time. What would have this been? This would have been like 2006, 2007. And I was just fascinated by this documentary because these were two men, Hitchens and Douglas Wilson, who had such commanding knowledge of Scripture, but came to two diametrically opposed positions on the issues. You would see Christopher Hitchens throw Scripture out and then make one point. Douglas Wilson throw Scripture out and make the complete opposite point. And I started to gain an appreciation for what ideas smart people could each other through debate. And so I go to Indiana University and I join the Secular Student Alliance and I start engaging in a lot of this debate. And then Christopher Hitchens dies in 2011 and it becomes 2012. This is my last year in college. and I get word that Douglas Wilson is coming to campus. This was my opportunity in my mind, right, to play my hero, Christopher Hitchens. I was like, Douglas Wilson's going to come to campus. I'm going to show up. I'm going to come prepared with my Christopher Hitchens-esque questions. I'm going to read all the background literature. And I'm going to ask him these questions. I'm going to take him to task for his beliefs. But almost as soon as his appearance on campus was announced, I started getting rumblings that it might not be the forum that I hoped it would be for debate. I arrived at the debate hall, I believe this was spring of 2012. You go back, I worked as an opinion columnist at the time. I wrote it up. I think it's still on the website. And no sooner had Douglas Wilson started speaking than students in the audience up and interrupting him. Banners were unfurled. Every time he started to speak, someone cut him off. At one point, the police had to come in. At another point, some of the protesters had to get escorted out. But once they were escorted out, they were still banging on the doors. The event never became the event that I hoped it would be, which was a Christopher Hitchens, Douglas Wilson, sort of Lincoln Douglas, so to speak, style debate where I would get to ask him the questions that Christopher Hitchens might have asked him. And it was around this time that I sort of began to have an appreciation for intellectual debate, the marketplace of ideas, and why it's important to let speakers who we disagree with or might vehemently disagree with let speak. And so I went there to teach Douglas Wilson a lesson, but he was the one who ended up teaching me a lesson in a certain part, or a lesson to the audience. He said one thing during that speech that I'll never forget. He said, I always think I'm right, but I don't think I'm always right. I always think I'm right, but I don't think I'm always right. What he was kind of telling there was some of the philosophy that, if you've read John Stuart Mill's famous 1859 book on liberty, that John Stuart Mill was trying to get across. John Stuart Mill talked in that book about how to refuse a hearing to an opinion because they are sure that it is false is to assume that their certainty is the same thing as absolute certainty. Their certainty was the same thing as absolute certainty. This is what my peers at Indiana University were doing. And they had essentially decided for themselves that they were right. And because they had made that opinion or made that decision for themselves, they weren't going to let anybody else in the audience hear what Douglas Wilson had to say and make that opinion on their own behalf. They were going to assume that responsibility for them. They violated not just the rights of Douglas Wilson to speak that night, but also the right of me to listen, which goes hand in hand with freedom of speech. If anyone's read Frederick Douglass' famous 1860 speech, A Plea for Free Speech in Boston, he talks about how one of his abolitionist meetings in Boston was interrupted and shut down by a violent mob that didn't like what the abolitionists had to say. And Douglas Wilson writes in A Plea for Free Speech in Boston that freedom of speech and freedom to listen are two sides of the same coin. And he thought deep in his heart, and he puts this in the speech, that if freedom of speech were allowed to exist in the United States at that time, that the chains of slavery would not exist for more than 5 years, that they would be broken so long as people could make the argument for anti-slavery. John Stuart Mill in On Liberty talks about what we at FIRE called Mill's Trident, the 3 reasons why you should let people with whom you disagree speak. The first is that you might be wrong, right? You might hear from someone you disagree with a truth that you hadn't otherwise considered. You also might be right. And it's still important to hear what those you disagree with have to say, because you gain a greater conception of the truth through its confrontation with error. If you believe something and it's true, but you never have to actually explain why it's true, you start to hold it, as John Stuart Mill said, like a dead dogma. You don't know why you believe it. It's held almost as a prejudice. You can kind of play this thought experiment in your head, right? We all know the earth is round. That's a truth. But have you ever actually had to have that argument with a flat earther? What arguments would you marshal? If you had to have that argument regularly, now, you'd probably marshal better arguments, and better, more concise, more convincing arguments to the flat earther. So that's the second reason why. The third is that you might be partially right, right? So the world isn't black and white. Our beliefs aren't black and white. Truth and falsity aren't always very clear. So you gain a greater conception of the truth through its confrontation with error. It was only a couple of months ago, or only a couple of weeks ago, where some of you might have heard that Ann Coulter was shouted down at Cornell. Now, Ann Coulter is an alumnus of Cornell University. She had spoken there 3 times, and she was invited, I believe it was by one of the conservative groups on campus, either TPUSA or Young Americans Foundation, I forget which one, to speak. And no sooner had she started speaking than the same thing that happened to me at Indiana University happened to her. Members of the audience, students started standing up, shouting her down. Now, to Cornell's credit, they had police on hand to escort these individuals off. But the students who were protesting, who wanted to shut the event down, knew that Cornell was going to take this tactic. So as soon as the one disruptive student was escorted out, another one would stand up, interrupt the event again, get escorted out, and then the next disruptive student would stand up, shout her down, get escorted out. How long are you going to play that game of whack-a-mole before you just decide that this isn't going to happen, or you escort the entire audience out and the event becomes purposeless at that point? But I want to draw your attention to one thing that one student said. We actually just posted a video of this. One of our lawyers explained the shout down as it was happening. We kind of paused the video and they kind of explained what's happening and why it's wrong. But one of the final disruptors said, "We don't want you to speak your words are violence." Now, this was striking to me. And this whole event at Cornell was indicative to me of 2 different trends that we're seeing in academia, not just the use of heckler's vetoes to shut down speech, but the use of the word violence or the language of trauma to justify shutting down speakers. This is concerning to me because a free society, a civilized society, is built on the idea that we use words instead of violence to solve our disputes. Sigmund Freud once said that civilization was born the day a man cast a word instead of a stone. Democracy is about debate and discussion to come to some sort of conclusion rather than violence to make our decisions. We leave our guns at the door, so to speak. And if you argue that words are violence, then you're making the implicit or explicit argument for using actual violence in response to words. Democracy cannot work in a society where we think of words as violence. Just think about, there was this Atlantic article that was written a couple of years ago that my boss, Greg Lukianoff, and his co-author of The Coddling the American Mind, Jonathan Haidt, wrote. A professor argued essentially that words are violence because they create stress, and prolonged stress can create physical harm, be detrimental to you physically, and therefore words are violence, right? But think about that. You have a dispute with your significant other. You get broken up with. There are a lot of things in our lives that stress us out and can create prolonged stress as a result of words that we exchange with each other. If that's the justification for violence, it's the rule that kind of swallows everything else. So Douglas Wilson's appearance at Indiana University was a formative experience for me, and I'm sure the event at Cornell for the students who were there will be formative experiences for some of them. But you see efforts to prevent speakers from speaking elsewhere as well. We've been seeing discussions about book bans across the country. And I always wonder whether the discussion of book bans is too cabined, right? We all hate the idea of burning books or of banning them, right? But you don't see the same chorus opposing speaker shoutdowns or speaker disinvitations. Is there something, and I always wonder to myself, is there something magical about putting your ideas on a page versus speaking them out loud? So is not a book ban in a way a form of a speaker shoutdown or speaker disinvitation? All of this speaks generally to what we at FIRE call a culture of free expression. And I worry that our culture of free expression is waning in this country. My boss, Greg Lukianoff, talks about how the strength of a culture sort of by the idioms it uses to talk about itself. And when I was growing up, and I don't know, I've got a 1-year-old son and I've got another one on the way. I heard phrases like sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never harm me, or to each his own, or it's a free country. Will my son hear those same idioms to kind of describe the culture that we live in, to kind of give ourselves the reaffirmation of what it's like to live in America, a free society? I don't know. I see too often now individuals' first instinct when they hear words they don't like isn't to say sticks and stones, or it's a free country, or to each their own, but to try and find a way to shut that speaker down. There was a story that came out recently about Amy Coney Barrett. She got a book deal from one of the big 5 publishers. I don't know, I think it was Random House. And there was a coalition of dozens, if not hundreds, of people in the publishing industry who wrote a letter to the publisher saying, you should not give Amy Coney Barrett platform. You should not have given her this book deal. You should rescind that book deal. Their justification was that she voted to overturn Roe v. Wade, and that the right to an abortion is codified in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which actually I went and looked. It's not actually codified. I think there's some people who interpret it to argue that, but it doesn't say anything about reproductive rights, whether it should or shouldn't. I don't have an opinion on that. It just doesn't. And I thought to myself, why is your first instinct, and especially you're in publishing, to try and shut Amy Coney Barrett down, to prevent her from explaining in a greater depth why she decided to overturn Roe v. Wade, a matter of significant public concern, something that I imagine a lot of Americans want to hear? Why wouldn't you let her make those arguments and then debate her while she goes on her book tour? Why would your first instinct be to censor? For me, that's indicative of a declining culture of free expression, especially coming from the book publishing industry, right? This is a place where you should have the broadest respect for freedom of expression. The book publishing industry depends for its vitality on the First Amendment's protections for a free press. I like to talk about how kind of opposing speakers like this, trying to shut them down, is just plain bad tactics. So this is the First Amendment Museum. I imagine some of the audience is pretty familiar with First Amendment concepts, so you're probably familiar with the Streisand effect. But in the off chance you're not, this is a phrase that was coined by Mike Masnick way back when Barbra Streisand tried to get a photo of her home taken down. What was going on? So there was this guy who was trying to document beach erosion on the California coast over periods of time. And so what he did was take pictures of the beach all up and down the coast and kind of timestamp them to see how the erosion progressed over time. And he made this information publicly available. Well, just so happened that Barbra Streisand's home was in one of those photos. And Barbra Streisand decided to take the extraordinary step of filing a lawsuit to have that photo taken down. Now, where does the name Streisand effect come from? Well, Barbra Streisand's home had about 4 views on that photo. As soon as she filed the lawsuit, and the reporting, because lawsuits are public, came out about it, the views of that photo skyrocketed to hundreds of thousands of views. And so the idea is that attempts to censor end up creating a greater platform for the speech or the expression or the ideas that you're trying to shut down. And I saw this firsthand in my work at FIRE. Way back in 2017, you might have remembered when Milo Yiannopoulos attempted to speak on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, the home of the Berkeley free speech movement. I remember, I think it was February 2nd, because it was the day before my birthday, and I was at home, and all of a sudden I get a ping on my phone that Milo Yiannopoulos was set to speak, but someone, maybe students, maybe not, maybe off-campus agitators, I don't know, started throwing Molotov cocktails, and the square was on fire. People were getting hurt, and the police had decided that this was a security situation and that Milo Yiannopoulos' speech could not go forward. Now, the ostensible aim of those protesters was to shut down Milo Yiannopoulos' his speech, to not let him speak, to not give his ideas a greater platform. But what did they do? They gave him the greatest platform possible. It became the story of the evening. I turned on Fox News. There he was. His book skyrocketed to #1 on the Amazon charts. So what did the censors accomplish? They just gave him a greater platform. And this is the Streisand effect in real time. And it's bad tactics. It's also bad tactics because, in order to censor, if you're not going to take it upon yourself to use violence, to use force, to use mob tactics to try and shut down people, you're appealing to a third party. And I like to ask people, who out there would you give the power to decide for you what speakers you can hear, for you what books you can read, for you what music you can listen to, or arguments you can hear? I don't think there's a person in this world with whom I would entrust that power. There's no angel in the world who I would decide for me what music I can listen to, what films I can see. But the idea of censorship presumes that there is someone out there, some angel who's immortal, right? Because, mortality means that the power of the censor is going to get passed on to someone who you might not approve. That there's someone out there with whom you would entrust this responsibility. Maybe you're a Donald Trump supporter. Would you entrust Joe Biden with that power? Maybe you're a Joe Biden supporter. Would you trust Donald Trump with that power? It's just plain bad tactics. And there's actually a story that my sort of mentor and hero, former ACLU executive director Ira Glasser, likes to tell from the 1970s. England has these sort of student unions that set a lot of policy for student groups across that country. And at one point, Zionist student groups had lobbied the student union to create a hate speech code that would essentially prevent students from criticizing their Zionist beliefs. And they were effective in getting the hate speech code passed. But who was the first victim of that hate speech code? The Zionist students themselves. Ira likes to talk about how censorship is like poison gas. It might make sense when the wind is at your back and the enemy is in your crosshairs, but the wind has a way of shifting. And the same tool that you can use against your enemies can be used against yourself. There's also just a concern about concept creep. So Nadine Strawson, the former president of the ACLU, likes to talk about how, maybe hate speech codes are a good idea. Because, and this is the reasons I should say, because it's a malleable concept. It's subjective. What is hateful to you might not be hateful to me. There was this appearance in 2018 at Brown University by a conservative commentator. And students, at the as many were at the time, protested him. They circulated a campus petition, said that he should not be able to speak there, trying to deplatform him. Benson supports capital policies are a tool of white supremacists, and white supremacy is hate speech. There's a lot of A to B to C to D to get there, but the essential argument was that free market advocacy for free markets is white supremacy, and white supremacy is hate speech. It just shows you how these sort of concepts can expand in order to attack or deplatform or justify censoring the speaker you disagree with. Now, you'll hear the argument sometimes like, okay, you allow for freedom of expression, but what about allowing for freedom of expression for people who would not support freedom of expression, who, in fact, if they had power themselves, would shut it down? You hear this about democracy as well. You give the people who don't support democracy or oppose democracy power. Are you just engaged? Is this just a suicide pact, right? But I think there's power in principle to bring people along. And I want to tell a quick story here about a guy named Maajid Nawaz, because I think it really speaks to why in liberal societies we defend the rights of our enemies. Majid, if you're not familiar with him, is a British citizen of Pakistani descent who became involved in his youth in the Radical Islamic Liberation Party, which was an international movement that campaigned for the reestablishment of a caliphate in Muslim lands. And it was actually a prohibited party in Great Britain as a result. Now, Majid himself wasn't really advocating for violence, but he was seen as an extremist or radical party in England and was therefore outlawed. He ended up going to Cairo on a trip and was detained, arrested, and interrogated for 12 weeks in Cairo State Security Intelligence Building, and then sent for pre-trial detention. Now, Amnesty International at the time was opposing sort of the bans that were happening across the world on the Islamic Liberations Party's political activity. They saw this as a freedom of speech issue. They saw this as a political dissident issue. And so they decided to send a delegation in 2002 over to Cairo to meet Majid Nawaz. Now, Majid at the time was abandoned by his colleagues in the Islamic Liberation Party. They wanted nothing to do with him because he was detained, and they were worried about what that might mean for themselves. And Majid opposed Amnesty International. Here's what he had to say about the experience, though, that is really striking to me. I was just amazed. I hated them. Aren't always hypocrites of my serious doubts. In March of 2004, 2 years after he first met with Amnesty International, Amnesty adopted him a prisoner of conscience. And finally, 4 years after his incarceration, he was released by Egyptian authorities. So why do I say this? I say this because I believe that there is power in principle. We live in an age of what I like to call the politics of expediency. We will cut down our principles in order to win short-term victories without understanding or appreciating the long-term consequences. John Stuart, the comedian, once said that if you don't stick by principles, your principles, during hard times or in the difficult cases, they aren't principles at all. They're hobbies. And I think people lose faith in principles as a tool for advocacy when they see hypocrisy and double standards. They see these hypocrisies and they see these double standards, and they breed distrust and cynicism. I think when you make arguments for free speech, you need to make it in a principled manner if those principles are going to win the day with skeptics or just detractors. You'll see folks on the left argue that, well, freedom of speech, it's just been co-opted by the conservatives. And you can make the opposite case maybe in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. Conservatives would say, oh, these are just liberal values. And I believe those arguments are made in part because they don't see their ideological opponents defending them when their speech rights are violated. And if we're going to defend free speech for me, we have to defend free speech for thee. And some of you might recall that phrase because it speaks to one of my personal heroes who passed away in 2017, who wrote the book on principled free speech defense with that title, Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee. This man, of course, is Nat Hentoff. If we have some younger listeners or viewers on this call, you might not be familiar with him, but Nat Hentoff, think of the most prominent public intellectual of today. And Nat Hentoff was like on that level in the 50s, 60s, 70s, say. He wrote for The New Yorker. He did a very famous profile of Bob Dylan, for example, but he interviewed all the big players of the day, Malcolm X, for example. And he was also a big-time jazz critic. developed and sort of spearheaded the idea of liner notes on jazz records. He's the only non-jazz musician to be inducted into the big Jazz Hall of Fame. But he was also a very principled free speech advocate. That was, in addition to jazz, freedom of expression and the First Amendment was his passion. And he one time talked to a jazz musician about these issues. The jazz musician knew, of course, he cared deeply about the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And the jazz musician said, I think it was Max Roach, but don't quote me on that, said to him, Nat, it makes sense to me that you support free expression and that you love jazz, because what is jazz if not the principles of the Bill of Rights or the Constitution embodied in music, right? You have this sort of framework that's set up, but with individual musicians have the ability to freestyle, to be ourselves, to express our individuality. Isn't that what the Constitution's about? Max asked him. There was a documentary made about Nat Hentoff that I highly recommend called The Pleasures of Being Out of Step, which is about his twin passions, freedom of expression and jazz. And I had the benefit of getting to know Nat Hentoff when I first started at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. We recently expanded our mission off campus to become the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE. I started my career as Greg Lukianoff's assistant. And in that role, I often liaisoned and helped him with his correspondence. And Nat Hentoff was on our board of advisors. And that was always a very kind of interesting guy. He would call us every time we sent a press release and asked him to fax it over because he said he didn't do email. Later learned out he actually did, but he hated it. And there was one time that we changed our website and he asked us if we could fax him over our old website because he couldn't figure out how to navigate our new website. I forget how he kind of navigated that one, but it was Nat Hentoff, right? This was the dean of the old school principled defense of civil libertarianism. He was the type of civil libertarian who inspired me to do this work in the first place. How could I not figure out how to use a fax machine as a young 22-year-old first starting out who had never sent a fax in his entire life? But Nat Hentoff passed away in January of 2017, and I ended up writing his obituary for FIRE just because of the impact it had on me and the way that I think about these issues. And I was living in New York City at the time. This was Nat's stomping grounds, and ended up attending what ended up being a very fortuitous and important moment in my life, his funeral, his memorial service at Riverside Memorial Chapel at the Upper West Side. And I walk in and I see Michael Myers, who's the leader of the New York Civil Rights Coalition, and I'm talking with Michael Myers, and two men come up to me. They say, "You're Nico Perrino. You do what we used to do." And I say to these guys, I'm like, "Well, who are you and what did you used to do?" And one introduces himself as Norman Siegel, the former New York Civil Liberties Union director, and the other introduces himself as Ira Glasser, the former executive director of the ACLU for 23 years, widely credited with taking the ACLU from sort of a mom and pop shop on the verge of bankruptcy to the national powerhouse that it is today. And I had known of Ira. Obviously, I'd never met him. That's why I didn't recognize him. And I was like, this is amazing. Here I am at the memorial service for the dean of the old school principled defense of civil liberties. And I meet, all these other old school members of the civil libertarian bar, so to speak. Unfortunately, a lot of those folks are retiring from the barricades or have, in fact, passed away. Norman Dorson, Nat Hentoff, for example. And so I felt like attending that memorial service like I was in Raphael's School of Athens painting for old school civil libertarians. If you're not familiar with Raphael's paintings, that one where you've got like Plato and Socrates and all these great ancient philosophers in there, I was like, these are my people. And so I asked Ira to come on my podcast, so to speak, the Free Speech podcast, which you can subscribe to wherever podcasts are found. And I'm like, Ira, can you just talk to me about your career? And he says, sure, I've been retired for 16 years. I might not remember much, but I'm happy to come on. And so a couple of weeks later, he trudges to my apartment in Kips Bay area of New York City and sits down. And 2.5 hours later, he's still talking. And I decide this is this is a hell of a story. And he told such vivid stories that painted a picture of why the old school did what they did. Why did Ira Glasser take over the ACLU in 1978 and assist in defending the rights of neo-Nazis to march or rally in the town of Skokie, Illinois? Ira Glasser, of course, being a Jewish man. And why did his colleagues, people like David Goldberger, Aryeh Nair, do the same? Aryeh Nair, a refugee of the Holocaust. If Frank Collin, who was the leader of the neo-Nazi party in Chicago, got his way, I believe he even said that at the time. Ira and David and Aryeh, might not be around. Frank Collin was their enemy, and Aryeh Nair, in fact, wrote a book about the experience called Defending My Enemies, which I encourage all of you to pick up. It's back in print. But I ended up making a documentary on Ira's life story, kind of as an homage. It's kind of my tribute to the old school principled defense of civil libertarianism that uses the story of Skokie as a through line to explain why we defend the rights of people we disagree with. And Ira's whole point is, who decides? Who are you going to entrust with that power to decide? And the same rules, we have in America neutral principles. Norman Siegel, the former NYCLU director, who I interviewed for Mighty Ira, once said, if I had a tattoo on my body, it would be neutral principles across my chest. In this society, the same rules that apply to you apply to others. So when Frank Collin wanted to march in Marquette Park, south side of Chicago, the city preventing him from doing so would ever be able to secure in order to have a rally in Marquette. The segregated South used to prevent civil rights marchers from marching and rallying in the South. And no sooner had that insurance bond requirement been passed to prevent Frank Collin and his group of neo-Nazis from rallying in Marquette Park than the Martin Luther King Jr. coalition, an sort of anti-racist civil rights group, wanted to rally in Marquette Park and was told they couldn't, essentially, because of the insurance bond requirement that they couldn't afford. So the same rules that we apply to our enemies will be used against our allies. And this town of Skokie, Illinois, in fact. So Frank Collin first tried to go to Marquette Park, and when he was prevented from doing so, he wrote 19 letters to suburbs around Chicago, most of which ignored him. But Skokie reacted like a bull to a red flag because it was a home for 6,000 Holocaust survivors. And they said, no, you can't come here. And they passed a bunch of ordinances to prevent him from coming over there, one of which was an ordinance that prevented individuals from marching in military uniforms, because the neo-Nazis marched in military-style uniforms. But who was that ordinance used against in addition to the neo-Nazis? The Jewish war veterans, who also marched in uniforms. So it's impossible, and I'll just close by saying this, and then we'll open it up for questions. It's impossible for us to create carve-outs for the speech that we hate to go after our enemies. It operates like poison gas. Again, the wind might be at your back one moment, the enemy in your crosshairs, but the wind has a way of shifting. This free speech for me and for the ethos that animated my heroes in the old school civil libertarian bar, I fear is falling out of favor. And we at FIRE are doing our best to kind of carry on that tradition. And we would urge all of you who I convinced today to join us in that effort. You can learn more about us at thefire.org. You can follow us on social media at thefire.org. And happy to take questions and happy to hear from those on the call who disagree with me why I'm wrong. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nico. And to everyone who's listening and participating, if you just put your comments or questions in the chat, if you're watching on Zoom, or in the comment section on Facebook, I'll try to get to those. But if anybody wants to chime in or has anything they want to add or any questions they want to ask, please put those in the chat or the comment section. And Nico, and again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Again, for those watching, Nico's on vacation right now, so he's doing us a favor, joining us tonight. So I'll start off, Nico. I guess this is the time where I go through and I give you sort of the standards, the standard modern American 2022 concerns over free speech. And I guess you can just take them down and address them one by one. So the first one that I always hear working at the First Amendment Museum is concerns over hate speech, things racism, sexism, homophobia, and their connection to the rise in hate crimes and all sorts of negative things. How can people be, I guess, anti-racist, pro-equality, and still defend free speech and still defend people who use free speech to spew hate speech? How do we rectify these two things? And how do we think about these European countries that have hate speech laws? And how would we respond to people who would like to see America adopt more European style hate speech laws?
Yeah, well, I'll take your first comment first, or your last comment first, excuse me, and just say, I don't know that I'd use Europe as a model for hate speech codes. Actually, I would use it as an example of how hate speech codes can go awry. Just give you two examples, right? There was a historian in Austria who was imprisoned for criticizing the Prophet Muhammad, arguing that he was essentially a pedophile and took children's wives. Now, you can say what you want, or you should be able to say what you want about any religion in the world, right? This is the most important question that we have about our humanity, right? How did we get here? This is what generated my interest, going back to my first story, and the arguments that Christopher Hitchens and the Four Horsemen were making in the debates between he and Douglas Wilson. So the idea that because that criticism of Muhammad was offensive and used the word hate in the law to justify taking him down, that that person not only shouldn't be allowed to speak, but should also be in jail, I think is contrary to any conception of a free society. And we also saw how these hate speech laws were wielded in England recently. Queen Elizabeth died a couple of months ago, and you'll recall that there were people protesting the royal family and sort of kind of the institution of the royal family at the time. Some even just holding up a blank sign, who were detained. I'm not sure if any of them were imprisoned on the justifications of hate speech or offense. There was also the guy who was fined and imprisoned for satirically making his pug dog do the Nazi salute. Kind of a crude joke, but I'd find it hard to argue that anyone doing something silly and stupid like that should be imprisoned for doing so. And the longer, I've made a lot of arguments why we shouldn't censor speech we hate during the course of this presentation, but one that I didn't make that I think is worth bearing in mind is that these arguments, these hate speech codes, justify in the minds of society often more dramatic action. Well, if this is a legal context, if this is harmful, if this is hateful, and it shouldn't be here in the first place, why am I not then in vigilante mode able to take this into my own hands? Why can't I then go stab Salman Rushdie 9 times, severing nerves, forcing him to lose eyesight in one of his eyes? Because there are a lot of countries in the world that say that what he wrote in the Satanic Verses is hate speech. In fact, in India, his home country, or no, I believe it's Pakistan, his home country. No, it's India. Questioners can correct me. The book is banned. You cannot read the Satanic Verses in that country, home where Salman Rushdie is, in fact, probably the most prominent public intellectual in the West, and most prominent writer from that country. So, these hate speech codes end up justifying in people's eyes more dramatic actions, more liberal actions.
and thank you for your question. And I want to reiterate this question because I have thoughts as well. I'm in college and see hostility towards free speech, particularly with protesters. Why are so many young people against free speech? And just to tack on to Anne's comment, I get this question a lot from older folks who visit the First Amendment Museum. They ask, well, these young people, they don't care about free speech. They want to silence everybody. Is there truth to the claim that young people, maybe even, I don't want to call out Gen Z, but Gen Z and millennials, is it true? Is there truth to the claim that they care less about free speech than older generations?
So we've done what we found is that there are kind of, and you could argue essentially three age groups, very distinct feelings about freedom of expression. I would not describe their feelings about freedom of expression as being outright hostile, but rather it's not a front of mind issue for them. And one of the things you learn doing civil liberties free expression work is that freedom of expression is a kind of advanced technique. It's counterintuitive, right? Like human beings, we have this innate, maybe evolutionary instinct to try and dispel anything that makes us uncomfortable or that we don't like. And censorship is one way of accomplishing that. The sort of theory that Nassim Taleb talks about in his book Anti-Fragile is not one that we human beings gravitate to instinctively, but it is one that's important for us. I mean, the lessons of freedom of expression, why you have it, are important. And what we find in the data is that they just need to be confronted with the arguments, and they can be brought around young people. You need to meet them with their values. And that's why I made the documentary Mighty Ira, talking about why freedom of expression was so important to all the social justice movements of past, focusing particularly on the civil rights movement. Say, Mighty Ira Glasser himself defended these rights because he cared deeply about racial justice and thought the only way to advance that cause was to allow them to speak freely. Freedom of expression is how you give a voice to the voiceless, right? If you don't have political power, all you have is your voice in a free society. So that's one bucket. Then there's kind of this middle bucket of people, let's say 22 to 40, my generation, millennials, who are more skeptical and outright hostile to free expression than Gen Z or the 40 pluses. And then you have people 40 plus who are kind of the age of the old school liberal values surrounding the First Amendment and freedom of expression. We call them at FIRE the reachables. So Gen Z is the teachables. Gen X, so to speak, is the reachables. And then my generation, we call them the in too deepables. They're just kind of harder to convince. And these, again, are broad brushstrokes. But I do worry that, Gen Z, why did they come up? Or Gen X, why are they reachable, right? Because they came up, them and the boomers, with in the era of the Berkeley free speech movement, the kind of rejection of in loco parentis. So prior to the Berkeley free speech movement in 1964, it was kind of prevalent on college campuses across the country to Apple to women parents, so to speak, but they away with all that. And Gen X, baby boomers, they remember that. They remember what it meant to give third parties positions of power, the authority to control your lives. And I saw Twisted Sister come up in the chat. That was the anthem, right? We're not going to take it. Parents, get off of our backs. And Dee Snider had to fight back against the Parent Music Resource Council efforts to censor his music and Prince, out of this kind of paternalistic notion that young people couldn't be confronted with that music on their own and make decisions for themselves, and parents wouldn't have the control that they needed in order to put age-appropriate music in front of their kids. So, but there is kind of this notion now with a younger generation that we need more authority to decide for us what we can hear, more authority for us to decide what we can see. And And when you see these arguments made by young people, it's not because we're worried that we will be corrupted, that I will be corrupted, but that other people would be corrupted. So it's like kind of paternalistic on the part of other people. But that's not how a free society should work. Remember, getting back to the idioms, to each his own. This is a free country, sticks and stones. So I hope that answers your question.
I want to move on to a different topic. What should free speech supporters say to those who believe we must censor hate speech to protect others? This is from Madeline P. Thank you, Madeline, for the question.
Yeah, well, first of all, tell them to watch the documentary I made, Mighty Ira, because it's all about how the tools that we use to censor can be used to censor those we disagree with, can be used to censor those that we agree with, our side as well. This is getting back to the poison gas analogy. But the first thing you need to do, just as a tactical matter, is to figure out what those making those arguments, what their values are, separate from freedom of expression. So if they care about gay rights, explain to them the story of Frank Kameny, a gay rights activist who utilized his free speech rights in order to advocate for gay rights and ultimately prevailed in doing so. All you need to do is talk to Jonathan Rauch, a famous public intellectual who also happens to be gay, or Andrew Sullivan, to say, we won our rights by going out there and demonstrating our humanity, by making the arguments. We did not seek to censor our opponents. We sought to use moral suasion. And over time, we broke down their prejudices. This is the same thing that this guy, Daryl Davis, a Black man, who I have a great fortune of knowing, and I visited his home. He ended up meeting members of the Ku Klux Klan in the 80s and discovered that through just having conversations with them, demonstrating his humanity, that their prejudices over time would slowly break down. And one of the first members of the Klan that he met ended up, after getting to know Daryl Davis, leaving the Klan and giving him his robes, because he knew that he figured out that the racism that he harbored in his heart was not true. He had just never met a Black man. And Daryl thought he was onto a tactic there, and ended up deciding that it was going to be a cause of his life to go and have conversations with bigots. And when I went to Daryl Davis's home, he brought out the dozens and dozens of Klan robes that he now has in his home, sort of the demonstration of the power of persuasion, of meeting people and demonstrating your humanity to make the world a better place. And I put together a podcast about that for, so to speak, my podcast, which you can hear. I believe I did that episode in 2018, and I would recommend it to all of you as kind of how you can break down prejudices and why you don't need to resort to censorship to eliminate bigotry. I should say, what does censorship accomplish? We talk about small t truths at FIRE. It's important to know the world as it actually is, not just, and my boss, Greg Lukianoff, likes to say this, not just when people have hateful or bigoted things to say, but especially so, right? Because you need to know that there are issues in your society that you need to confront, and people who hold prejudices or dogmas that you need to overturn. Censorship is like breaking the thermometer, right? You might not know what temperature it is anymore, but the temperature is still the same, right? You're not changing the temperature. You're just not knowing what it is anymore. Greg Lukianoff likes to say it's like taking Xanax for syphilis, right? It'll make you feel better taking the Xanax, but it's not going to solve your syphilis problem. So.
Today in America in 2022 is, doesn't free speech enable misinformation and disinformation? And haven't we seen in the past couple of years how dangerous misinformation and disinformation can be? Shouldn't we put some restrictions on expression in order to clamp down on these things that are happening, that are costing us lives or hurting our democracy?
Well, I find the rise of the word misinformation to be interesting. It's not a word that was really in our political lexicon more than a couple of years ago. Before that, it was fake news, right? Before that, it was just lies. I don't know why lies just kind of fell out of fashion. But this isn't new. We live in a fast-changing world where people now have the power to reach a broader audience than they ever had the power to do in human history. And some of the same things that we're seeing now, if we were just students of history, and to become a student of free speech history, I recommend Jakob Mushangama's book, Free Speech, a story from Socrates to social media. I forget what the subtitle is. But when the printing press was first invented, the Catholic Church tried to put restrictions on it because people were printing, what was essentially argued at the time to be misinformation. They used different words for it, but lies, blasphemies against the church. And we eventually figured out, it took hundreds of years, how to live in a society where people had access to more information than they ever had in human history. And I feel like we're just in the early days of social media, and we're still trying to figure out culturally and as a matter of norms how to deal with greater access to information and the ability for people to speak to a wider audience than they ever had the ability to do in the past. And I worry about rushing too fast to sort of regulate this. How do you regulate it in other than to establish like sort of a government ministry of truth? It's harkening back to George Orwell's 1984, where Winston Smith worked in the Ministry of Truth, deciding what was true and what was false for the government in that novel. Misinformation to me is a phrase. It's like the new hate speech, right? It's malleable. It's in the eyes of the beholder. I remember the early days of the pandemic, right? Where masks weren't going to help you, but then they were. And all the shifting conversations that were happening around COVID as the science was unsettled, and things that were misinformation are now potentially true, if not true. The lab leak theory, I remember social media tagging warnings on them, if not outright censoring posts about the lab leak theory. But then you have Joe Biden going out there and saying, after his CIA and other intelligence agencies conducted intelligence operations on this, saying this is a credible theory. So I worry about jumping too far on the misinformation bandwagon as a justification for censoring speech.
Great. Are there any plans in the near future for more movies, more films, documentaries?
First of all, Glenn, I think you might be one of the most committed or rabid Fire fans out there. I follow you on Instagram, and I always appreciate your signal boosting what we're doing. So I thank you for tuning in today. Nico Perrino directed documentaries, no immediate plans. My wife, who I think is on the call here, I don't think would be happy if I jumped into making another documentary, because there was a lot of nights and weekends and stress, and that could be a whole nother podcast about the challenges of making an independent film. I didn't ever made a film before I made Mighty Ira. I had no idea how to do it. I made Mighty Ira because I thought it was a story that needed to be told. And I decided I was going to tell that story and figure out anything that needed to get done, learn as we go what needed to get done in order to make it. So unless another story just happens to fall in my lap, as that one did after I met him at Nat Hentoff's funeral that January 2017 morning, I'm not sure, but we'll see.
So third argument I want to bring up against free speech, or a third concern I have against free speech, is obscenity. Aren't things just obscene? And I mean, what is the value of things like pornography in terms of how they enlighten our civil discourse? And don't some things just need to be regulated or even censored? Like, there's some disgusting stuff out there in the age of the internet.
Yeah, the question though is who decides, right? Who decides? You have Philip Roth's novel being censored because it's quote unquote obscene at times, but now we look at it as a great piece of literature. Ulysses, a book that was banned from importation here in the United States and is still nonsensical in my mind. I'm sure it's arguably a great piece of literature, and people who are into it are really into it. But the sort of stream of conscious thing that has never really made sense to me. But that was banned. Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, determining what qualifies as art and what doesn't qualify as art. Who was the Supreme Court justice who said, "I'll know it when I see it"? Like, do you really want to live in that society? where those in authority know what should be censored once they see it. I'm not sure I do, but the pornography, right? Let's say you don't believe that's art. There are things that people do just for pure entertainment. OnlyFans and pornography websites are some of the most popular websites in the United States. And often you'll find, if you go through the annals of history, that those arguing for the censorship of pornography are the most depraved among us. You happen to learn. So it's always the justification that other people need to be prevented from seeing this. Never that I need to, right? I have the self-control. My superego is much stronger than yours. So the same arguments sort of apply to obscenity that I'd argue that apply to hate speech and misinformation as well.
Popular comic strip that was going around the internet, that if we're tolerant of intolerance, eventually intolerance will take over and squash out tolerance. You know this argument?
Oh yeah, that's Herbert Marcuse's famous argument from the Frankfurt School. Like, the argument is essentially like, if we tolerate, and as you said, tolerate intolerance, then it's a suicide pact. Going back to my story about Majid Nawaz, right? They're going to sort of overthrow the democratic or liberal norms that we hold near and dear, and those ideas of toleration won't exist as a result. If you read Herbert Marcuse's arguments, though, he's essentially arguing for justifying the censorship of conservatives. I think he even uses the word conservative. But this is what a liberal society stands for, right? Like, this is the idea of neutral principles. The only other option, and I'd argue it's not a good one, is a subjective application of those principles to people I essentially like. Like, I'm going to determine on an ad hoc basis whether you get to enjoy the same freedoms that I get to enjoy, and who gets to define what's tolerant and what's intolerant, right? The students at Brown University who wanted to ban Guy Benson because he argued for capitalism, which they then argued was white supremacist, and then as a result was hate speech. Like, that's the road you go down. The road to hell, they say, is paved with good intentions. I'd say the road to censorship is as well.
So on Monday, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments for a Supreme Court case 303 Design versus I can't remember the other name, but yeah. So could you tell us a little bit about that case, some of the facts of the case, and then your opinion on the case, and how do you think the Supreme Court should rule?
Yeah, so I mean, a little bit of background about this case. You have a designer in the state of Colorado who creates bespoke or custom wedding websites for people who are having weddings. Why? People who have weddings don't use Zola or one of the other very easy to use. I got married in 2020, and I would never have thought of having a custom website. But anyway, a same-sex couple wanted to hire this firm 303 Creative to make a bespoke wedding website for them. The proprietor of that site, of that design firm, was religious, said making custom wedding websites for a same-sex couple violates her freedom of conscience. She would be happy to provide them a template website, but she did not want to bring her design skills to bear on a same-sex wedding website. This harkens back to the case Masterpiece Cake Shop, I believe, from the 2018 Supreme Court term, where the Supreme Court punted on the free expression issue. Is baking a cake a form of artistic expression? And decided on religious liberty grounds that because the cake baker, who I believe his last name was Phillips, held religious objections, that he did not need to bake a custom cake for the same-sex couple. He was happy to provide like a already made cake that wasn't custom, so this case is essentially trying to get the heart of the matter. Is creating custom art a form of expression that isn't subject to the public accommodation laws in the state of Colorado? And I believe there's a lot at stake in this case, right? And I did a podcast about it recently. Can you be compelled to speak against your will, especially in cases where your resources and your creativity is finite? Can a ghostwriter be compelled to write a book that they don't agree with ideas that they don't agree with? Can a screenwriter be compelled to write a screenplay that they don't agree with? Their time is limited. They have to make choices. I would argue no, to the extent that you are engaged in artistic, creative expression, so long as if you have other vehicles to provide services to people, or if you have other vehicles to provide services to people that don't involve any sort of creativity or artistic expression, you provide those in accordance with the public accommodation law. I don't believe that government can compel you to speak and can compel you to create surrounding ideas or beliefs that you disagree with. And I'd urge folks who want a more kind of extensive discussion of the law and the facts in that case to check out my most recent podcast that came out yesterday.
Follow-up is, wouldn't that open the door to people to be able to discriminate on the basis of things like race as well?
Yes. Yeah. And that's the challenge. And that was one of the discussions in the oral argument on Monday, right? It's like, okay, you oppose same-sex marriage, and you won't do a wedding website for a same-sex couple. What about an interracial marriage? That was one of the questions. And if you take the argument to its conclusion, that's what you have to adopt. And I don't dismiss for a second the implications for that. But the costs of forcing creators to create works that they disagree with is in my mind an infringement on free expression, in my mind an infringement on the First Amendment, and not something that we should be doing in a free society. And I'm not sure it was the idea behind the motivation for public accommodations laws in the first place, the idea that we all need to have, regardless of status, the ability to access banks, the ability to get a clean room in a hotel, the ability to eat at the restaurants of our choice. There's a distinct difference between that sort of service and being forced to write a book or being forced to bake a cake. And you should read the brief in Masterpiece Cake Shop from the cake makers, who argued that baking a cake, a custom cake, is a form of art. And art, as we know, if you take the position that art is a form of expression that is protected by the First Amendment, then you really do have to grapple with the idea of forcing people, compelling them under punishment of law to create art or to create expression that they disagree with. And, it's difficult. I understand the challenges here. These are the margin cases that make free expression defenses difficult. But I can't say that art is an expression and that's not protected by the First Amendment.
So speaking of current events, why do I keep hearing Elon Musk, Twitter, and free speech used in the same sentence? Can you give us a little rundown on what's going on with that and your thoughts on Elon Musk's newfound commitment to supposedly to freedom of speech and the First Amendment on Twitter?
I'm not sure I can give you a little discussion, but I'll try and give you kind of a brief overview. I just wrote a 2,500 word piece for Fire called Elon Musk, Twitter, and Free Speech Culture. You get with, when you're talking about social media, kind of a melding of First Amendment law, a melding or a confusion between First Amendment law and free speech culture, right? Like on the one hand, you have Joe Biden's press secretary going out there and saying that they're very concerned and that actually Elon Musk and Twitter have a duty to police hate speech, or a responsibility, I think was the word that you used, to police hate speech or take action on hate speech and misinformation. And they're going to be watching closely. This is a sort of government jawboning that's being utilized as a form of extra judicial or extra constitutional speech suppression. What does it mean for them to be watching him closely? I don't know. So that raises First Amendment concerns, right? But then you also have this question of what should a private company like Twitter do in moderating speech or censoring speech? Do they have the right to do so? Well, under current First Amendment law, yes, they do. But should they is the question. And can and should is where a lot of the confusion comes up surrounding this. So you'll see some people on Twitter surrounding some of the revelations from Matt Taibbi and Barry Weiss argue that these are First Amendment violations. They're not First Amendment violations, at least under current understanding of the law. But one of the things that we like to do at FIRE when we're kind of analyzing these situations is ask ourselves, well, what's the purpose of this organization? What does it put itself out as? And what values does it hold? And are they keeping to those values? So Twitter says it's akin to a public square. And if you're trying to represent the public conversation, does viewpoint-based discrimination surrounding opinion, viewpoint-based censorship surrounding opinion manipulate the public square in a way that runs contrary to those values? I'd argue yes. In a way that, if you're a LA Dodgers fan and you have a forum for them, and you say up front that anyone who hates the LA Dodgers isn't going to be allowed in this fan forum, I'm not sure it would. Twitter's trying to represent a broad, at least puts itself out as trying to represent a broad swath of public opinion on these issues. Can Elon Musk be inconsistent in the application of the principles? Sure. He said, for him, freedom of expression is that which matches the law. Well, what does that mean in a place like India or Pakistan, or a place like Russia, or a place like China, where the law is very censorious? It's hard to be a free speech absolutist, as he describes himself in that context. He also said freedom of speech, is important, but it doesn't guarantee freedom of reach. But then you see Barry Weiss coming out yesterday talking about shadow banning. Now, his understanding might be like, okay, you don't have freedom of reach, but that freedom of reach needs to be applied without double standards. I think Barry Weiss in her reporting argues that it was applied disproportionately to conservatives. So there's a lot of confused conversations. We have 9:30 a.m. meetings every morning at FIRE to kind of rapid respond to all the free speech news that's happening of the day. And our conversations have been dominated by Elon Musk. And I saw, just as I was logging on to give this speech, that the next batch of the Twitter files came up. So I was kind of frantically trying to figure out, is there anything I'm going to need to be working on related to that tonight? A little bit exhausted by it all, but
for anyone in our audience, what is the
Twitter? So Elon Musk essentially said after he bought Twitter that he was going to release all of Twitter's files related to its, moderation or censorship practices previously to a handful of journalists. And I think those journalists are Barry Weiss, who runs the Free Press, and Matt Taibbi, who has his own Substack blog, with the one condition that they have to publish the findings first on Twitter, which makes sense, I guess. But they document kind of how Twitter had done content moderation in the past, and they're still coming out. So, and I guess they're coming out as I speak right now. And there's a lot of confusion surrounding, what Twitter is doing as it relates to the First Amendment, to the extent there's any sort of entanglement between government in that case. There probably does raise First Amendment concerns, but to the extent it doesn't, and it's just like the misapplication or the inconsistent application of Twitter policies, or the biased application of Twitter policies, doesn't raise First Amendment question because it's a private publisher, but it does raise questions of fairness, double standards, and what we want in a culture of free speech where you have a platform that reaches billions of users, but doesn't live up to its values as a public square.
So any last questions from our audience, please put them in the chat. I'll ask one last question. FIRE seems to have a focus on college campuses. Why the emphasis on college campuses?
Yeah, well, we expanded actually off campus on June 6th of this year to do free space. On our campus work, we defend a bunch of different civil liberties: free press, religious liberty, due process and privacy work, our free association. But our bread and butter has always, and what we've become known for, is free expression, free speech issues. And then we've been doing that on campus since 1999. But in June, we decided to expand the free speech portion of our mission off campus with a 3-year, $75 million expansion. And we've been doing a lot of infrastructure and capacity building in order to do that. We'll bring our public advocacy, our litigation, our research, our kind of moral suasion to off-campus issues. And there's been a lot of work that's going into that since we've done it. Including kind of figuring out how we're going to come to positions on things like social media, for example. We know what our campus positions are, right? We've been doing them for 23 years, but what are our positions on like Elon Musk and Twitter? But we always retain a core competency on campus, right? Because this is where a lot of the free speech debate has happened over the last 10 years. These are where new ideas are germinated. These are our marketplace of ideas. This is where the future is created. And these are places that depend for their discovery of truth on the kind of confrontation between different ideas and the ability for people to explore. Academic freedom is a corollary of free speech, of course, and free inquiry. So we'll always have a core competency in higher ed and a core concern there, but we're now going off campus too.
One who tuned in today, again, please consider donating to the First Amendment Museum. Just if you Google First Amendment Museum, you'll find our website. Donate to FIRE. I'm sure you guys take donations, right?
We do. I appreciate you having it. So I won't put a plug in for us here. I'll put the plug in for the First Amendment Museum. I've never actually been to the campus in Augusta, Maine, but I'm looking forward to doing it. Don't you guys have the Bong Hits for Jesus?
We do. Yes, we have.
Used to be in the museum.
Famous landmark historic object from a landmark historic decision, Morse v. Frederick, a famous Bong Hits for Jesus banner. So if you're ever in New England,
wrongly decided case, I might add, but yes.
Sorry, a wrongly decided case. Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that opinion. I think a lot of people. But again, thank you so much, Nico. This was great, and thank you for all who attended. Please check out our website for more offerings like this. So thanks again, everybody.
Thanks for the time.